What is going on? Germain, Craddock here. And in today's episode of the Dr. Rises podcast, I have a very special guest, Jessie Wagner, and we're going to be speaking about STEP and COMLEX, more specifically Step 1, when you should take your board test. Yes, Daisy, hi. How to prepare for boards, how to use the resources to your best of your ability, and really how to set yourself up so you're hitting the ground running and you can pass and exceed expectations when you are preparing for boards. So, Jessie, will you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Like Germain said, my name's Jessie Wagner. I'm a third-year TCOM student. I'm currently on orthopedic surgery, but more interested in family medicine or neurology at this point in time. I'm kind of keeping my mind open, I should say, to kind of whatever strikes my fancy. So, originally I went to school at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I studied biomedical science there. I also did a master's while I was there in human anatomy and physiology before coming to Fort Worth for med school.
Well, thank you for coming through.
Thanks for having me.
So, naturally, you've done STEP and COMLEX.
Yes.
You've done it now that they swapped to pass-fail, and you were part of the guinea pig class.
Absolutely. We love it.
How did being part of the guinea pig class feel?
I think the frustrating part was just that there's no information out there for us, for my class, also for your class, but probably a little bit more for you guys now. But there was just really nothing out there that explained what that difference really meant and how it would affect us. And there's really still not, because there's no data, because we haven't gone through the match yet. So the most frustrating part was just trying to figure out the difference between like what the school was telling us and maybe what reality was. But I think now that I've taken it, I definitely do not regret taking both. I've been telling everyone I know, make sure you take both. So I think you're going to set yourself up the best.
So then on that note, introducing, so Step 1, COMLEX 1, I remember starting medical school. You take board exams.
Yeah.
I had no idea what that means. So I guess starting off, what is STEP and COMLEX? When do you take them, and what are the purposes of those exams?
Okay. So STEP and COMLEX are really, they're the same for the purpose that for the MD students, for the allopathic students, they have traditionally taken USMLE Step 1. It's the first in a set of 3 board exams that we as medical students and then eventual residents have to take in order to get our licensure. So Step 1 is the allopathic version. It's administered through USMLE. And the NBME versus COMLEX is like the osteopathic version, the DO version, which is administered by the NBOME. And really they're the same test in a lot of ways, like they're testing the same foundational knowledge. The differences that I found were just that COMLEX is much longer. It's 352 questions versus Step 1 is 280 questions. Okay. COMLEX 1, of course, has OMM on it as a kind of core category versus Step 1, which does not have OMM on it. The other differences are pretty slight. COMLEX 1, having taken both, I will tell you, is the interface just isn't as nice. It's not as clean of a test. It's not as straightforward of a test as Step 1. Step 1 is very much like, if you studied and you know your material, you will know the answer. COMLEX is kind of like, well, you studied hard and here's this really convoluted question stem that has so much extraneous information in it. And then we're going to give you 5 answer choices, and really 3 of them could be argued for. But other than that, they're essentially testing roughly the same info with the exception of OMM.
And then, so as far as timeline goes, when do you take Step 1, Step 2, and then also Step 3, or I guess COMLEX as well?
Yeah, so Step 1 or Level 1, you take traditionally after your second year of medical school. A lot of medical schools are kind of getting new age with that and moving it up a little bit. And some are even moving it a little bit later. It just depends. But traditionally, after you've completed your second year of medical school, before moving into clinical rotations, you would take Step 1 or Level 1. Step 2, Level 2, traditionally you take after your first year of clinical rotations. So I'll be taking mine in July. And so that's will be after your third year. And then step 3 is not a test that you have to take, unlike step 1 and step 2. Step 1 and step 2 are required for us to graduate. They're required to participate in the match. Step 3 is one of those things that people take for licensing purposes. So for us, we will probably have to take COMLEX Level 3 regardless. And then step 3 is kind of, you can take it or not. It kind of depends on whether you want to do a fellowship or not. So that one's a little bit more up in the air.
So is that one required for fellowships?
I wouldn't say it's required, but it's kind of like step
Strongly
is
encouraged?
now. Yeah.
Okay. And then you mentioned that you register for the exam. So when do you register for these exams, and like where exactly do you go to register for them?
Yeah. So for step 1, level 1, I registered in January-ish, the year I was going to take the test. So for example, I took my test at the end of May of 2022. And so I registered in January of 2022. So like 6-ish months in advance. Yeah. And the same thing for level 2 or step 2. I just registered like this week for my exam, which will be in July.
Yeah, because I know for NBOME, for the COMLEX Level 1, I know since we're 6 months out, one of the things for us is registering at that 6-month point, because if you don't, those spots get taken up and there's less exams that are being proctored.
Yeah, that's true to an extent. I always tell people that as the time goes on, as it gets closer to your exam, they usually release more dates, which was my experience. I think that's kind of traditionally how it has worked. Because the demand is higher, and you don't have to register for those exams that early. Like I know people who decided at the last minute that they did want to take step 1, and previously they were only going to take level 1. And they registered in March or April and were able to get a date, no problem. It just might not be where you would necessarily prefer it to be.
Is it relatively easy to either move your exam or just find a spot?
It's very easy to move your exam as long as you're more than 30 days out.
Okay.
I believe it's free if you're more than 30 days out. I moved mine several times because when I first signed up, there were very limited dates and availability in our area. And so I think originally I was signed up to take it in Waco. And then as I checked kind of more frequently, because I really wanted this one particular date, just that was going to make my like vacation line up perfectly. So I kept checking it just kind of periodically throughout the spring and was able to get my preferred date. I did have to drive to Wichita Falls, but
that's not too
It's not
bad.
too far, and I kind of liked it. It was a fun little getaway. You like go stay at the hotel the night before and just have a night. But yeah, so you don't have to register that early, and dates will come available.
Okay. When does the exam typically start? Like what time?
8 a.m.
8 a.m. Okay.
Yeah, usually you have to be there no later than 7:30 because there is like quite a significant check-in process. You know, they check your ears and your sleeves and like all your pockets and make sure you're not hiding anything. And yeah, there's a significant lag before you can actually sit down and take the test. So
I remember when I started growing my hair out, taking standardized exams. They're like, is that a hair tie or is that a watch? I'm like, dude, I have long hair. Like, it's a hair tie.
Yeah.
I don't have a watch on. I know you said no. And you mentioned earlier, so the COMLEX typically is longer, not only, but it's a little bit more convoluted as far as some of the questions.
Yeah.
What are some other like notable differences that you found between USMLE and COMLEX?
This is probably going to shock some people, but I personally found step 1 to be an easier exam than COMLEX Level 1. Because of that very reason. I think the questions are much more straightforward. The interface is also like very well designed. So there's no lag. There's no like confusing places you have to click for images or exhibits. There's a better flow to it. The breaks are really nice because after every single block, so there's 7 blocks of 40 questions on step 1. And after every block, you have an optional break. COMLEX, you have a kind of set bank of break time and you can take it whenever, but it's not, it's not built into the testing interface, if that makes sense. So you really have to monitor your time much more closely with COMLEX, because if you decide you want to power through a couple blocks or if you want to take a break every single block. Like, you just have to be really aware of your timing. Versus STEP, they kind of make it a little bit more regimented. And so I think that is honestly the biggest difference. The style of questions are just a little bit more confusing, convoluted. The timing is different. COMLEX is just, it's a long test. Mm-hmm. It really wears on your stamina a lot more than I think Step 1 did. I came out of Step 1 feeling great. I was like, that took me 5 hours. It was quick. It was easy. Well, not easy, but it was relatively painless. COMLEX was not that way. It was long and just kind of brutal. And by the end of it, I was like, I'm done. I'm ready to like take a nap and eat some food. But those are the big differences.
How long did COMLEX take you?
COMLEX took me, started it a little bit before 8, and I think I finished around 2:30, so closer to like 6.5 hours. Versus STEP, I finished pretty much right after noon, like 12:15ish. So it was a much quicker test for me.
And then, so you mentioned you and some of your classmates decided actually to end up taking STEP. I know we've had some administrators that are, just take COMLEX, don't need to worry about STEP. I think sometimes that information can be obviously conflicting and a little difficult. What is actually the benefit of taking both of the exams, and why should you potentially consider actually doing both?
I think for me, the biggest reason to do both is just the unknown. Like the fact that we don't have any data about how residency programs really do value COMLEX being pass-fail versus scored. In the past, everyone, for the most part, has been in agreement that taking STEP is a good idea because of the scoring factor. I don't know why switching to pass-fail would suddenly eliminate that. Like, program directors have never really been well-versed in COMLEX, it seems like, from what I've read and heard from others. So I don't know how switching to pass-fail really changes that. I do think that if you're interested, like if you know for a fact that you just want to do like P&MR or family or something that's much less competitive, then you could totally get away with only taking COMLEX, especially because those fields are DO heavy. However, my experience with rotations has really been that most people anyway, have no idea what they want to do until they get into it. Like I, for years and years and years, have been like, I want to do neurology. And I've gotten into rotations, and now I'm like, wait a second, do I want to do neurology? Do I want to do family medicine, which is something I always thought I was going to hate? And you have the converse where people get into it and they've thought they've always wanted to do family, and all of a sudden they're like, I kind of want to do gen surg, and you want to set yourself up well for that kind of a situation. And I think for those more competitive specialties, it's not really an argument that STEP is recommended. And so it's like, why would you not just for your future self, why would you not set yourself up? And they're the same test in a lot of ways. Like if you're preparing for one, you're preparing for the other. So in my mind, it's like, why would you not? Unless, there are reasons to not take STEP. If it's expensive, it's time consuming. So if you have like serious financial limitations, or if you're, have a giant event, like people getting married a lot around that time, and you can't make both work, like that makes sense. But for most people, I think it's a good idea to at least consider taking both and prepare to take both.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people in your class and other upperclassmen, when they would take both, they would do COMLEX a few days after they did STEP. So they would do, I think it was like 7 days. So that way all the board prep they had done would just carry over, and during that gap, they would focus on OMM.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I know, for example, like, because I'm interested in orthopedics, so obviously I'm more well-versed in what competitive specialties want. For some of those, especially traditionally ACGME specialties,
yes,
they're not even going to consider it unless you have a STEP score, because how are they supposed to compare apples to apples if you don't have that score?
Right,
And like you were saying, if they don't know what the COMLEX equivalent is, they're not necessarily going to go out of their way to find that out, because it's still a different exam. So why not put yourself in a place where you can not only be competitive, but also where you're being compared at the same level as those other students.
Yeah. And I think it also, maybe this is a silly reason to take it, but I think there's a lot of like, I don't know what the word is. Like, there's a lot of precedent that DO students shouldn't take STEP because it's harder and they might fail. And having taken both, I will tell you that I do not think STEP is harder than COMLEX. I think it's the opposite. And B, I think that really sets us up in a bad way to compare, like going forward with the residency application process. Like, if you really do want to be considered equivalent or, equal to MD students, like, why would you not prove that you can take and pass their boards too? Like, I don't understand why there's 2 tests in the first place, but since there is, we might as well take both and kind of.
Yeah, for me, I think it would be nice if there's just an addendum for DO students that just, here's the addendum to this exam, you have OMM.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, that's just a happy wish list.
That's another conversation.
Yeah. So for board prep, obviously I know every school sets it up differently. Some of them, they take boards very early on, like during their second semester, their second year, like in January. They only do 18 months of didactics. For us, we go all the way up until May, and then you have basically a month of dedicated.
Yeah.
I know this is maybe a little bit of a loaded question, but when should you realistically start looking to board prep?
It depends on what your goals are. I think last year, being the guinea pig year of it being pass-fail for the first time, I asked a lot of third years at the time, like, okay, when realistically should I start studying? Because if it was scored, it kind of changes things a little bit, right? Depending on what your goals are. And I got everything from like, start studying January, like you would if it was scored, start studying around spring break. I had one person tell me like, start studying during dedicated, like it's pass fail, well, do what you need. For me, I really started studying around spring break, like January-ish, around this time last year. It was on my mind. I was kind of doing it sporadically around classes, like, because we're still in school, we can't just like drop everything we're doing and study for boards 100% of the time. So I would just do it kind of when I had time to do it. But I will say that, it was not a priority for me really until spring break. And that's when I really kind of sat down and was like, all right, it's kind of crunch time. I need to actually get serious about it. And I think that was more than enough time. I took my boards at the end of May, so I had a slightly earlier test than a lot of other people because we had until mid-June essentially to take it, but I wanted a vacation, so I took it end of May, and I felt very prepared by that time. So it kind of depends on your goals. If you're wanting to crush your exam because how you do on step 1 is the best predictor of how you do on step 2, then you can start earlier. If you're just trying to get that pass, you can start later. It just kind of depends on your starting point too. Like, if you're a really strong student, you probably don't need to spend 6 months studying for boards to be able to do well. If you've struggled a little bit, you might need a little extra time just to give yourself the confidence that you need to feel good about going into boards. I think that anyone who's done decently well in classes for the last 2 years, I think TCOM's curriculum really sets us up well. So I think if you've done pretty well in classes for the last 2 years, I don't think that there's really a worry about not passing the exam. But the biggest thing is feeling good enough going into it, because we had a lot of classmates cancel their exams last year, cancel STEP anyway, because they just weren't feeling confident about where they were at, and building that confidence takes time. So if you're not one of those people who feels pretty good about where they're at, then give yourself more time. But if you feel pretty good about where you are in your kind of learning or studying journey, then you maybe don't need as much time. So I know that's a very vague answer, but I really think it just kind of depends on what you want to get out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's because it is so person specific, it's hard. You can't really generalize it.
Yeah.
I think it very much so depends on the individual, and at that point, it's very much so being honest with yourself and being honest with like, okay, well, how much can I dedicate? Can I spread it out earlier now?
Yeah.
Or do I need to like actually like get to it and really hit it hard, post spring break? And unfortunately, I think that's an answer that only realistically you can answer for yourself.
It is unfortunate. I wish I could, write a schedule for every person and it could work for everyone, but I just don't think that's how it will go.
Yeah. And now that I know there's just a lot of different ways to go about studying for STEP. So I know some people, they love dirty medicine. Some people, they love FirstAid. And we'll talk about resources in particular and kind of expand on them. But is there any certain methods or things that you think that are just like, look, this is definitely something you need to look into?
I was a big fan of Amboss last year. That's been the only thing that I think is maybe different from most other people. I know a lot of people are starting to use Amboss. It's just not as common as some other resources. I just love it as a learning platform. So for me, I was very afraid of UWorld. I'm still afraid of UWorld. UWorld and I don't get along, but it is a great resource. So because I was intimidated by UWorld and I had used Amboss a little bit before, I knew that I liked it. I liked the interface. I kind of started out with that and I used it for the practice questions, but more so for the articles and kind of just the whole like conglomerate of everything that Amboss is. So basically what I would do, I did not want to jump into mixed blocks. So there are kind of like two different ways to approach practice questions. You can jump straight into like mixed blocks, which cover everything under the sun. Like it is a grab bag of whatever you could possibly imagine. Or you can do systems focused blocks. And I started with mixed blocks because I thought that's what we were supposed to do. That's just what I knew. So I started there and it felt very overwhelming for me. And so I found the reason I kind of gravitated towards Amboss was because they have it broken up into systems. If you'd like to do it that way, where you can just go day by day and do a block of cardio, a block of renal, a block of whatever. And for me, that was much more manageable. And I loved that when I did a practice question, it was so easy to study from that question. So have you ever used Amboss?
I have not.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of people haven't. I love it. But basically when you click your answer choice or right or wrong, it pops up the explanation for why every single answer choice is correct or incorrect. And within each little explanation, there's all these links to Amboss articles, and all of these articles, it'll like pop up in a split screen for you. So for example, like if I'm doing a question like a neuro block and I get a question about Guillain-Barré, and I'm saying this because I had a question like this for step 2 like yesterday. So and I get the question right or wrong, doesn't matter. I can expand every single answer choice and it'll give me like very in-depth of like why this was correct or not correct. And within that, there's little underlined, like every condition, every disease, anything you could imagine is like underlined and linked to an article on Amboss. And when you click on the link, it splits your screen and pulls up the article on one side and you still have your questions on the other side. So you can kind of like skim the article. The articles have videos embedded. Like for me, that was just the most like one-stop shop place to learn the material. I don't think it's the best testing resource. Like UWorld's definitely the best question bank, but UWorld is not the best, in my opinion, like learning resource because the explanations just aren't as good. So Amboss is really the only thing that is not super familiar to a lot of people that I really recommend. I used FirstAid as a reference guide. I use Dirty Medicine. He's my guy. I love him. And I use like Pathoma, of course. That's like kind of a non-negotiable, but those are all pretty standard. I didn't use anything that was new or wild or unheard of.
So then, so since we're talking about resources, I guess quickly going over it, just for people that aren't familiar, since there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
We'll start, I have a list right here. We'll start at the top with Pathoma. So what is Pathoma and what is it good for?
Pathoma is a service, I guess, online that also has a textbook, companion that they'll send you if you sign up for Pathoma, that has all of these videos by Dr. Satar, and he's a pathologist. So the book kind of covers all of your like past two material, like disease and treatment. Like that is its core. And it goes from like fundamentals of disease, like neoplasia, all the way through each of the systems. And it's just a very high yield, simple, short breakdown of all of the like high points that you need to know. And it's probably the single best like textbook out there for board prep, I would say. Especially now that it's pass fail, because it's really about those like high yield highlights.
No, I like, I use Pathoma whenever we're doing just like, I'm trying to get an understanding of the diseases. We have, especially with the PowerPoints that we get sometimes, they're just like not comprehensive at all. It's like, I have no idea what you're saying about this disease or what's high yield. I go to Pathoma, I read about it. I think there's 4-6 bullet points. Everything I need to know, either the genes that are activating, inactivating it, what it causes, what are the signs. And it's just real quick. I mean, they also have the videos, and he does go into a bit in more detail in the videos. But if I just like really quick need to know what I need to know about this disease and the high yield points, Pathoma is my thing.
It's the best. It's just short and sweet. Love it.
Yeah. And then, so Boards and Beyond.
Boards and Beyond, I used a lot during medical school because he's very thorough. I think his name's Dr. Ryan.
Yes, Dr. Ryan.
Yeah, Dr. Ryan. He's very thorough. And they're really helpful videos. They're like the best, I think, for learning things on your first pass.
Yeah, that's why I use Boards and Beyond for my first pass. So when I'm trying to just like wrap my head around what is going on, first pass, Boards and Beyond. And then anytime I see it from then on, I'm like, okay, I remember I've seen this before. It's not as intimidating. And it's just like, for me, it's a nice way to be introduced to something.
Exactly. His voice, like, I don't know what it is about it, but whatever that man says, it sticks in my brain. Like, I remember I'd be taking tests last year, and it's like word for word, I could hear Dr. Ryan just like speaking it to me. And I was like, this is amazing. But it's similar to Pathoma in the sense it's just like, high yield, a little bit more in depth probably than Pathoma is.
I think he doesn't focus necessarily so much on the pathology.
Yeah.
He very much so focuses on just overall, just like this is a subject matter, this is what we're talking about, and like these are all the things, not only the background information you need to know, but also the pathology that goes with it. And so I definitely like, there's not a textbook associated, but he goes off his slides, but it is definitely more thorough than Pathoma. So like I'd use Pathomas when I just need quick hits.
Exactly.
But Boards and Beyond for me, like that first pass just very much so feels good for Boards and Beyond.
Yeah, so I didn't use it too much for actual board studying because, theoretically having used it for medical school, like class studying, it was all kind of there, but it's a lot of time to go back and watch all those videos. So Pathoma is nice because you just have like the little textbook and can go reference.
All right, now Sketchy,
I'm sure everyone knows what Sketchy is, but it's this amazing service that like makes these super memorable videos with all of these like visual cues to remember certain things in medicine. So like bugs and drugs is classically what Sketchy is famous for, because they'll take Staph aureus and turn it into like this like beautiful image that you'll never forget.
I still remember the picture with the pharaohs, and then it has the vancomycin card.
Exactly.
Like I think for me, I really like Sketchy when we're doing FODT, which is Foundations of Disease Transmission. So the bugs and drugs class that we take, like I use that religiously for that class. Absolutely. And everything I needed for that specific bugs and drugs just stuck. And it worked really well. I've tried using it for other things, and it doesn't hit the same. It doesn't hit the same.
It's not the same. I know. I'm the same. I love it for bugs and drugs. I don't know how I would have gotten through like micro without it. I still don't know how I would get through life without it for like, especially antibiotics. But for Sketchy Path, it just doesn't work for me. And it works for some people. Some people love it. It's just the videos were too long for me.
Yeah. And the other thing for me with Sketchy Path is that it would go into more detail than I needed. And there would just be like, okay, well, that's nice, but I don't need to know all of that. And if I did, like, there's certain like high yield hits that I could get from just looking at like Pathoma.
Yeah. I used Sketchy in board studying just for bugs and drugs, basically, because there is a lot of that on boards, as you could probably imagine, because every system, I'm sure you're getting this now doing your past too, but every system brings back bugs and drugs. So I mostly, watching videos is very time consuming when you're trying to study for boards. So I used it primarily for like the little snapshot that they have at the end, because I actually, paid for Sketchy, and when you do that, they have like at the end of every video you can just pull up like the final image with little
numbers,
that will kind of take you through the image. And that's, for me, was the best way to review, because I didn't want to spend 20 minutes watching a video again that I'd seen 7 times already. I just needed to kind of bring back some of those little cues.
Yeah. No, I think earlier on it's fine, but I think when you're getting in the weeds of it, it's just very time consuming to watch, 7 separate videos on all of the amoxicillins and penicillins and all of those drug classes, the lactamases, all.
But it is nice to go back and just look at the final image and be like, oh, yep, I remember what this, whatever the little cue is.
Yeah. You mentioned Dirty Medicine.
Yes.
I actually haven't used Dirty Medicine yet.
I love Dirty Medicine. I think Dirty Medicine was probably my most used resource that was not a question bank for step 1 prep, because he's amazing. It's free. It's on YouTube. Like, anything you could possibly imagine or be confused about, he has a video on it. And it's really nice because he also he presents the information in a very simple way, but then he also gives you like memory tools to help remember things. So for me, like, I cannot tell you how many times I've watched his video on the different type 2 diabetes medications, because they do not stick in my brain. Like Levemir, Detamir, they don't come naturally to me. And his videos are just so good and so thorough, but like high yield, give you the tools you need to remember it and be successful in the exam. And they're not that long. They're like 15 minutes. Put it on 2 times speed.
He's good for shelf exams.
Yes, shelf exams. I mean, I love this man for anything, really. But like the biochem stuff, because we don't get a ton of biochem in our curriculum except for the very first block of first year of medical school.
Nightmare block.
Yeah, nightmare block. There's a lot of biochem on step, and not a lot, but a decent amount. And his stuff was like super critical for me for that. I never felt like I would know biochem until I learned it through Dirty Medicine.
Yeah, I do not remember glycolysis or the prep cycle anymore, so I will be hitting him up for that. Are you an Anki user?
I'm not an Anki user. I've never been an Anki gal. I just can't. I cheat myself on flashcards. Like, I just memorize what goes in the blank, and I don't ever give myself the chance to like actually learn what's on the card.
Fair enough.
So I've learned over time to just ditch flashcards.
Okay. I know there's I know a lot of people use OnKing.
OnKing.
It's a very, very big resource. They have the Dorian deck. They have Lola Kapop. I can't remember the other decks in there.
There's also decks I know with Anki for people who are Sketchy users. Like those Sketchy and Anki go very well together because there's several decks that have all of this Sketchy images and like embedded that kind of cue you and trigger you to remember those little visual cues.
Yeah. But I think it's definitely. I think that's one of those where early on in medical school and early on in medicine, like there's some people it Sketchy really works for and other people it doesn't. For me, I think it just depends on the course material. Like for bugs and drugs, when we were doing a lot of Sketchy, really helpful. Other material, I'm just like, I don't understand the basics. So it's hard to just like have these very, very specific like flashcards on stuff that I just like, I don't even know what you're asking. I don't even know these words on this, on this little sentence. So what is the answer? And I think that's very much so one of those where it depends on the individual, but if Sketchy is for your not Sketchy. If Anki is for you, OnKing is definitely one of those, and there's definitely quite a few other decks that are like worth looking into. I just love using the filtered deck feature when I'm doing that, so I can like filter in certain subject matter or videos or whatever.
Yeah.
You mentioned Amboss. Are you using Amboss for step 2 now still?
I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just, like I said, I think it's a really great learning resource because one of the things I struggled with UWorld, which I did do a lot of UWorld, but the thing that bothered me about it was their explanations are just kind of trash. They're not the best. They're either too thorough, like so in the weeds that it's like, okay, hold on. I need to get a basic foundation down before I'm like lost in the weeds. They're either that or they're like very high level and they don't give me the detail that I feel like I need. And so then I ended up going to outside resources anyway. So it was just a little bit more time consuming because I'd be like reviewing my blocks and trying to, review questions that I missed and those that I got right to, and having to go like search for these things and all these different resources. Whereas Amboss for me is, like I said, a one-stop shop kind of where I can do questions and learn all in one platform without ever having to leave that little web page. So I really like it. I will switch to UWorld at some point because, like I said, I do think the questions are better in terms of like reflecting how the questions on the exam are, but it's not that time yet.
Yeah, fair enough. I know because I started since I started board studying, I guess the first week we came back to school, I guess that's January 2nd is when we came back. I started, I think, UWorlds a couple of days into our first semester, and I realized early on, there's like, okay, how am I supposed to answer these questions? One, we haven't gone through that material yet.
Yeah.
Or two, it would ask something super specific, and then I would go through the answer or the explanation. I'm like, that doesn't really help me.
Yeah.
Or just be like something that's like, really? Like that's, I remember, there's one question. It was asking about like Pathoma pallidum and then chlamydia, and it was asking about like the family of those bugs, and I was like, I don't remember this. It was something super, super specific, and I was like, why, like, what is the point of this? And like, it didn't really explain it really well. She's like, okay, moving on.
Yeah.
I was like, I spent the time going through the explanation, and I was like, I still don't feel like I learned what I needed to learn.
Exactly.
And again, like, I think the questions are, I mean, they're hard.
They're hard.
And I go through 10 questions takes me 30 minutes. To go through 15 takes me 45. So I'm like, literally it's 3 minutes per question, because after, even if I get it right, I review the other answer choices, and I really want to like sit down and like be able to understand, because they could ask about the other 4 answer choices if there's 5 answer choices, and like being able to learn from that is time consuming, but for me it does also help. But definitely helpful. I get what you mean by Amboss. Like, I know they're very hyperlink happy.
Yeah, they are.
So especially with if you have Amboss linked to like your Anki account, you can hold your, I guess, finger on it, and it will literally show you a little link on it, article, explain what that word is.
Yeah, that's true. I've never thought about it being hyperlink happy, but that's so true. Like anything that they can link, it's linked.
Yeah. That's not a bad problem to have.
No.
And then I know for us, we also have the TrueLearn question bank. How do you feel that compares to the UWorld?
I did not use TrueLearn at all for step 1 or level 1 studying. I use it now for COMATs because we have to. Basically, like all of our clinical rotations have assigned TrueLearn quizzes that we have to do. And I do think that the TrueLearn questions are more similar to COMLEX. So if you're preparing strictly for COMLEX, TrueLearn might be a good resource. I wouldn't pay for it if the school didn't pay for it for us. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way and buy it personally, because it's not going to be good enough prep for step 1, I don't think, in my opinion. But it definitely mimics the like kind of convoluted questions that COMLEX asks you. The hope though is that like you study the material well enough that regardless of the question, you can get it right based on knowledge or like content.
Just have to do a little bit of translation.
Yeah, you just have to be a little patient, I guess. But I didn't use TrueLearn. I think I tried using it for like the OMM specific questions, and I just didn't think it was really worth my time, as bad as that sounds.
No, I think I did 1 or 2 practice tests or practice sessions with it, And I just like went through it and I was like, this is the stupidest question
Yeah.
that you could have, in the most convoluted way you could have asked it. And like, what is, like, I'm not getting anything out of this because I'm trying to have to figure out what you're asking me in the first place. Like, I should read a question, know what you're asking me, and then be able to look at your answer choice. Okay, this is it. Not spend 5 minutes trying to like translate what you're trying to ask me and figure out what is this even saying.
That is how COMLEX Level 1 is, though. So, you know, if you're worried about that component, maybe TrueLearn is the right resource for you.
And lastly, so FirstAid. What is FirstAid good for, and when would you use that?
Yeah, so FirstAid is a giant textbook of everything you could possibly ever want to know that is tested on boards. And I did not touch it for a while, and I wish I had used it earlier because it's such a good reference textbook. I know a lot of people who like will straight up read FirstAid. I can't imagine doing that just because it's not set up in a format that like reads super well. But it's such a good reference, especially for like biochem, genetics, things where you just need to like go refresh your memory, see a good diagram. Again, kind of like dirty medicine, FirstAid is like full of really helpful little memory tools. So I remember I used it a lot for a lot of the like inherited, like congenital conditions, like, you know, Downs versus Edwards versus Patau syndromes. They had lots of really helpful stuff in there for that. So I used it mostly as a reference. The other thing I used it for is the very end, the last 30-ish pages of FirstAid is, I think it's called like high yield review. And it's literally just like 30 pages of tables containing things that are super high yield for the exam. So in my last like week before the test, I just was done with UWorld. I said, no more of you. I'm done. And I pretty much switched to just doing things that I knew I had struggled with throughout the entire time of board studying. And by doing that, like focusing on those 30 pages of just like super high yield stuff, I cannot tell you how happy I was that I did that when I left STEP. I was like, thank God, because it was so high yield. It was true to its name. It was really helpful. And I feel like there was enough, just like reading it once or twice was enough for me to be able to recognize those little nitty gritty things on the test.
Yeah, I like, I typically do it's not UWorld, I do FirstAid as part of my first pass, especially in our systems classes and stuff like that. And that really helps me, especially, again, with some of our convoluted PowerPoints that we have. It helps me just figure out, like, what is high yield about this, because it goes everywhere from anatomy, physiology, to the pathology, and then pharmacology. Yeah. And that's how it's set up. And so I just typically now skip the anatomy physiology because we don't really need that as much.
You don't.
And focus more on the pathology. And then if there's anything like on there, I'm like, okay, this is a good mnemonic for me to remember, because obviously like our professors may not give us something like that. I'm like, oh, good. Found my mnemonic, moving on.
Yeah, it's great. It really is.
And so since we've talked about a lot of different resources, what is probably your go-to like top 3 that you're just like, these are the ones I could not live without?
Couldn't live without. Well, I'll throw UWorld in there just because I think it's kind of required at this point, even though I don't really love it. But, you know, whatever. It gets a spot. Amboss for me gets a spot. Dirty Medicine gets a spot. And Pathoma gets a spot. I know that's 4.
That's okay.
But
that's okay.
That's my top 4. Pathoma, especially, I don't think that... yeah, I just think it's like super high yield. I don't know how I would have really gotten through board studying efficiently anyway without it.
And then I think the other problem is that there can also sometimes be too many resources.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to try and pick too many. Like, okay, well, I need to do 5 things. What would be a point where like, okay, this is too many resources. I need to like narrow down and figure out like, this is what's working for me, what's not. Like, is there a number?
I don't think there's a number, but I just think there's a lot of redundance in the resources. Like people always talk about like Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, like those are essentially doing the same thing. So I would say pick one of them, you know, pick your favorite. I personally think Pathoma is probably the way to go because it is really geared toward the exam. Like Sketchy, Pixarize, Picmonic, those are all the same thing. Like pick one, pick your favorite. I know some of them are good for some things and not so good for others, but it just gets expensive
Yeah.
for the most part. Like if you can make it work with all of those resources and you have 10 and you love them all and you don't want to get rid of them, like that's fine. Do your thing. But I just think you have to have, it's all about being efficient when you're trying to study for boards, I think. Like learn the material and as quickly as possible. And I just think if you have just an overwhelming number of resources, that becomes a little bit more complicated. So for me, I usually go Pathoma and dirty medicine. And if I still am struggling, maybe FirstAid. But
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good place to limit yourself and not really do more, because there's only so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
You can't do everything.
I also think that like if you're someone who has been using a certain resource for all of medical school and you love it, like don't feel pressured because it's now board time to switch to some resource that you've never used before. Because I just stick with what you know, like I wouldn't get crazy trying too many new things around this time unless it's, I don't know.
So then, since currently our second year class is in the middle of still didactics,
Yeah.
board prep and doing classwork, I know you started more or less around spring break, so you're towards the tail end of it. How does that work? And is it actually, possible to balance both of it, or how should you really focus on trying to prepare?
I really looked at my classwork as board prep because it is, like, especially you guys are in GI right now. GI is huge on the exam. So I definitely would not neglect your classwork for two reasons. Number one, like neglecting studying whatever you're studying in classes at that time is not helping you really further your board prep that significantly. And number two, residency programs now only get to see whether you passed or failed boards. They still get to see your general grades in classes. If your school is like pass fail, ours is pass fail honors. So if you have an opportunity to honor a class and you're going to sacrifice that to study for boards, to me that's silly, because it's like residency programs will still see your transcripts, and some schools still do like traditional grading. I don't know how many. So I would say focus on your classes first for right now, and then kind of like sneak the board studying in when you can, of course. Like don't completely shut that out. But as second semester for you guys anyway goes on, it will get much lighter. Like FOBS is our last block of the year, and it is very nice and easy to get board studying in. So I think study for your classes as much as you can, because that is preparing you for boards. Like you guys being in GI right now, like I said, GI is a huge component on boards. Endo repro, especially endo, which is coming up next for y'all. Endo is a huge component on boards. So learn that stuff well. That way when you're in the thick of it and dedicated, you're not having to go back and study this stuff. Like ideally, it should be fresh enough that you don't really have to review it a ton. So that's my 2 cents on that, but I know that's kind of a hot take.
So then, I guess timeline. So obviously, board prep is it's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Not a sprint.
So it's very much so you're taking your time. You're learning this as you're going along. You're not trying to cram it all. You're not going to cram it all in 1 week. It's not possible. So looking at a timeline of studying, for example, we'll just start off at 6 months out. What should your studying be mainly compromised of?
For me at this time last year, I was really reviewing the past 2 content that we'd already covered. So for us, we had like musculoskeletal 2 was our first block of our second pass in medical school. And that's where I started, because like I said, I was very overwhelmed by jumping straight into mixed blocks. So I was like, you know what, let's do this in a systematic way where I feel like I'm going at it in some sort of organized fashion, and I'm not just like faced with all the world of medicine ahead of me. So I really used this time to review content from the previous semester, really. So I started giving myself 2 weeks basically to review each block. And during that time, I was using Pathoma. I was going back and, reviewing some Sketchy if I felt like I needed to. and doing practice questions. And I honestly really liked that approach. I think it felt very doable. Like it felt like chunking. Like it felt very much like, okay, well, I can tackle this one thing at a time. I can't tackle everything in first aid right now, but I can tackle, musculoskeletal too. Mm-hmm. That's not bad. And so I just kind of did that. I did musculoskeletal 2, gosh, can't say that. And then neuro, and then, whatever, renal, cardio, and kind of made my way through the blocks that way, so that by the time I was approaching dedicated, I was like pretty much through all, like a second pass, I guess you could say, of all of the content. And it's nice because you don't have to, it didn't require a ton of work to do all of that. Like, I wasn't studying hours and hours every single day for boards. I was getting an hour or two in most days if I could.
Sure. And then, so let's go 3 months out.
3 months out, kind of the same thing. I didn't really change up my study methods. First of all, I didn't really start studying until 3 months out. But I didn't change anything from like when I originally kind of fake started studying in January. So I kind of just continued doing that process. Because like I said, in January, I originally started with mixed blocks, got very overwhelmed, switched to doing system-focused blocks. And it was much more sporadic than it was starting around spring break. Around spring break, I was like, okay, for real, every single day, I need to be making time for this. So I would say I just got more focused rather than changing methods at all.
So then did you start dedicating more time after spring break, or how did that change?
Yeah, after spring break, I just, was like, okay, from now on, it's time to try to do 40 questions a day and stick to that as much as possible. Obviously, when we have an exam, that's not happening. But in January, it was kind of like board studying was like on the lowest kind of rung of my priorities. Maybe not the lowest, but it was down there. Versus come March, it was like, okay, classes come first, then boards. Like, it's time to get more serious. So I just focused on really trying to be more consistent and spend more time with board studying after that.
And then when you started dedicated, so dedicated started the beginning of May?
Yep, May 2nd.
What did you start as far as, so basically that's free time.
Yeah.
Free time to just hit it hard with board studying. What did you focus on when you started that, and how did your study methods change over that dedicated period?
Yeah, so dedicated is when I really shifted gears from doing systems focused blocks and kind of reviewing previous content to jumping into UWorld, jumping into mixed blocks. And basically what I did in dedicated every single day was just UWorld blocks. So my goal was typically 2 to 3 UWorld blocks a day, because there are 40 questions each. They're mixed. And if you're doing a really thorough review of them, like one block, taking it and then doing the review could take you 2 hours easy. So 3 in a day, that's a pretty full day of studying. But the biggest thing I focused on was doing the blocks and doing a really good review. And I think I just tried to follow, I know a lot of people have a schedule, of like, oh, we're going to do blocks and then also review X, Y, and Z on this day. I didn't do that. I just really felt like, for me, I needed to just kind of follow the like loose trail, if you will. So I would do these blocks in UWorld, do a really thorough review of every single question. And when I came across a question or like a concept, I guess, that I was not strong on, was not confident in, just kind of felt like I have no idea what this question is about, I would do a deep dive on that particular topic. And I kept a running list. And I actually really liked this that I did. This is like the one thing that I did that I think should be more common practice, is every time I did a block and I'd go through my review, I would write down the questions or like the topics that I was really weak on. So I had on my iPad, I had this like blank document where, for example, like I really struggled with like porphyrias. I don't even know how to say it. Porphyrias. Yeah, I think that's right. Like acute intermittent porphyria and stuff like that. I really struggled with those because I was never a heme gal. And so I would write that down. And then later that day, I would go watch Dirty Medicine, review it in Pathoma, and like on my iPad document, kind of draw myself pictures, take notes of the high yield things, and highlight the important things, and then move on to the next concept. So the next thing I got wrong that I just simply did not understand, because a lot of times when you're doing UWorld blocks, like you can know an answer and still get the question wrong just because UWorld's a wild thing. You know, like you don't trust your gut, you read the question wrong, whatever. But if there was something that I just straight up was like, yikes, this is not an area that I feel confident in, write it down, go do a deep dive, take notes on that thing. And by the end of Dedicated, I had this long list, like probably 30 pages of notes on high yield concepts that I repeatedly was missing. And so in my last week before my exam, guess what? I had like a pre-made document of all my weaknesses, basically, that I could go back and review right before the exam.
I know, I think also UWorld incorrects on if you're an Anki person. I know UWorld has like ID numbers for all their questions, and you can basically unsuspend the questions related or the cards related to that question.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Wow, yeah, that's just something I've heard. So I think you can essentially like you find the ID number, you search it in the whatever card browse feature, and then all the cards related to that question unsuspend. And so those are part of your UWorld incorrects.
That's nice.
That's another one because I know with UWorld they also give you the breakdown of like the subject matter, the topics, and like these are the percentage that you're getting right, you're getting wrong, and you can more or less gear like let's say for example like I'm arbitrarily say immunology, and that's the one like I get like 2 out of 10 right. On my past tests that I've done, like, you know what, I need to do some more immunology. And I think for me, that's one of those nice things with UWorld for me early on is I don't know where my gaps are.
Yeah.
I can assume, but until like I get a database of like my questions and that I'm getting consistently wrong, I'm like, okay, wow, I'm really at immunology and like this is what I really need to focus on. And that's for me like the power of like having that like those graphs, those charts, those things that like tell you like, look, this is statistically what you're doing poor on. This is what, I mean, if you use that resource, that's like what you should focus on.
And I think that's a really good point because something I have been telling your classmates and other people is like, make sure you know what your strengths and weaknesses are when you're going into studying. Because if you're really strong in cardio, like cardio's a huge part of STEP. And if you're really strong on that, like you don't necessarily need to be spending a ton of time reviewing cardio. But if you suck at renal's also a big part of the exam. So like that's how I approached it anyways. I was like, I know that I struggled, like had to work way harder in renal and heme, for example. So that's where I'm going to spend a lot of my time. And that worked out for me, I think. But also I would say to people to look at the exam breakdown because you can look on STEP on like the NBME and the NBOME's website and it'll tell you like what kind of rough percentage the exam is based on category. And I'll tell you like 50% of the exam is a mixture of cardio, pulm, and GI, like right there. It's a huge component. So if you're weak in any of those areas, that would be a good place to spend a lot of time. Whereas like neuro, I love neuro, very strong in neuro. I think there's like 2 neuro questions on my exam. So it's not something to necessarily, it's not a good way to spend your time, I guess, spending, time on those like nitty gritty things that aren't super high yield. The other things that I started doing during Dedicated was to start taking practice exams. I try to take at least 1 a week, usually 2. So first week I did UWorld Self-Assessment 1, which is nice because it gives you a predicted score. But I will also just tell people that UWorld is hard. UWorld tends to underpredict performance on exams. not saying that like if you're failing a UWorld step 1, like don't worry, you're gonna do great on the actual test. Not saying that, but it does tend to be a little bit harder, I think, than the actual exam. We also have to take COMSE, I think is what it's called, in the first.
There's 3 of them. We took one.
You took FBS, and
FBS.
then you take CBSE in May, and then the COMSE in the first 2 weeks of dedicated. And that's like a pretty good indicator of what the questions on COMLEX will be like. I don't count that as a practice exam personally because it was required and I was just kind of getting through it as quickly as possible because we had to take it within like our first week, I think, of dedicated. Other practice exams that I used would be the NBME forms. And I actually found these to be more helpful than the UWorld self-assessments, which is another hot take, I think. The NBME practice forms they're 200 questions usually, except for the free 120, which I'll talk about later. They're 200 questions. They're short. Like, they're not, the question stems are not representative of what you'll see on STEP, which I think throws a lot of people off. But I think the content is like such a good representation because even though they're asking like a short question about something, that topic will show up on the exam. So it's really good to know, I think, how you're doing just generally content-wise. Whereas UWorld self-assessments, they're much more specific, these long question stems that you will see on the exam. But I think they're a little bit more like nitpicky, nitty-gritty than the questions on the actual exam. So it's kind of finding a balance. But so I did some UWorld self-assessments, some MBME exams, tried to do at least one a week. And to simulate like a full-length test, you can just add a couple blocks on UWorld afterwards, which is typically what I do. So instead of dedicating one day to doing 3 UWorld blocks, I'd say, okay, well, this is my day to do a full-length practice exam. So I do my 200-question practice exam and then back to back with 2 UWorld blocks.
So then the NBME, how is that actually formatted? What does that look like?
Yeah, so you can go on the NBME website and you can pay for these tests. They're like $30, I think. And it's the exact same interface and format that the USMLE Step 1 exam will be. So it's nice to get that like exposure to how the actual exam looks, how you interact with it. It's just annoying that to do it officially, you have to pay $30 for every single test because I think I took like 3 NBME practice forms. They also did in COVID year in like 2020, the NBME published some of their exams as PDFs, and those are floating around on the internet. So you could always do that. It's just it's a PDF form, so it's not at all like the same interface that you will see on the real exam. You have to like either print it out or do it on your iPad. But yeah, that's an option if you don't want to pay the $30 for the exams. But it's not $30. It's not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. Oh, hello.
You're back. So then those ones, they're published by the NBME. They're not quite as in detail or full length as far as the question goes.
Yeah, they're definitely like question length. They're like max 3 sentences, whereas the questions you're going to see on the exam are like whole paragraphs with like labs and everything. And you won't see as much of that on the practice forms. So in that sense, I understand why people say it's not representative because, yeah, the questions are nothing like what you'll see. But the things that the questions are asking about, I think, is super representative of what's on the exam. They're just asking it in a very straightforward way, like, no frills, just like, hey, what is this answer, like point blank, versus, of course, like on the actual exam, they're going to make you work for it a little bit more. So again, I think it's a really good representation of the content. Like if you know that content really well, you're going to be set up very well for the exam. But just be aware that the questions, like you're going to require a lot more stamina to get through the actual exam. So it's kind of give or take. But I just was frustrated at that time with UWorld because I felt like the questions they were asking are the same style, but they're much more nitpicky, nitty gritty. So,
Fair enough. Is there any other resources or things that you're like, yeah, this is definitely something that I'm very glad I did?
The other thing I would say that I'm really happy I did is I reviewed in the last week before my exam, I reviewed chapters 1 through 3 of Pathoma, which you'll find everyone on the internet tells you to do that. And it's so worth it. It's like very high yield. You just have to be able to recognize that kind of stuff on the exam. So having it fresh in your brain before you take the test is, I think, a good idea. And then the second thing, or I guess the third, is the NBME Free 120, which I mentioned earlier. So that is a free exam online that anyone can take. That, again, same exact format and interface as the actual like USMLE Step 1. It's 120 questions, so it's quite short. And it's been rumored that those questions often show up on the actual exam, and that was true for me. Like, I had at least probably 3-ish questions that were like maybe not word for word copy pasted from the free 120 on the actual exam, but like so similar that it was like, whoa, I've 100% seen this question before, like 3 days ago. So I would always recommend doing that like 3-ish days before your test.
And then you mentioned that some of your classmates have said study to pass versus study to do well, like as far as it's graded, as you imagine it's graded. I've heard that before. What is your take on that?
My take is, again, it's one of those personal things. For me, I wanted to take the test as if I was getting a score. Mostly because I'm a perfectionist and I wouldn't be happy if I didn't do it that way. But I do think there's also like the fact that people always say how you perform on step 1, really sets you up for how you're going to perform on step 2. So there was kind of that motivation as well. But I wanted to walk out of the test feeling like if it had been scored, I would be happy with how I performed. That's just a personal preference. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, you know what, like, I'm just going to pass and go on vacation. Like, that is like whatever your personal choice is. Honestly, like, I don't want to say it's an easy exam to pass because you have to put in a lot of work to do it. But if you've put in the work, the chances of passing are quite high, Like, if you just showed up to take the test without doing any studying and any preparation, like, no, that's dumb. Don't do that. But I do think that if you're preparing well in a way that makes you feel like, okay, I could probably do this, you can do it. Like, if you think there's a chance you're going to pass, you're probably going to pass.
So then, since you've gone through step 1, you've prepared for it, you've gone through that, how do you feel like that's helped you now that you're in step 2 studying?
Good question. I think now I just have a better idea of what to do to prepare. Because before step 1, I genuinely had no idea if what I was doing was, quote unquote, the right thing. I was very preoccupied during dedicated, especially, that I was studying wrong. Like, I don't know where this came from. I try as a general rule to stay off of like Reddit and things because nothing good ever comes from that. But just hearing, like, going to the library, for example, and just like hearing all the different ways people were studying was like very overwhelming because I was like, wait, that's not what I'm doing. Like, am I going to fail because I'm not doing it right? Like, and having taken both and done very well on both, it's like, okay, I know now that like I know what I need to study. I know how I personally will benefit from like doing X, Y, or Z. So I have a lot more confidence of being like, no, I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to do it how I want to do it and not how like, Reddit says to do it or Student Doctor Network says to do it. And that's really the biggest thing.
And has anything changed as far as how you're studying between 1 and 2?
Honestly, not really. I'm still doing Amboss for the first couple months, and eventually I'm going to switch to UWorld when I am more, have more time to like really sit there and hit UWorld questions hard. But for me, since I feel like I'm in the kind of relearning a lot of this, well, not relearning, but bringing it all back stages, Amboss is kind of the familiar thing. Plus, I already paid for it. So it's like, I might as well use this thing that I've already paid for. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on now. Still using dirty medicine, still, kind of doing the same thing, just second time, rinse and repeat. But I will, now that I know, this is like a little thing, but I do not do well on study mode. So like when you get to UWorld or Amboss, whatever, there's kind of 2 modes you can do questions in. There's study mode and exam mode. I should be banned from doing things on study mode because for me, I'm like, I think this is the answer, but I'm really curious about this one. Like, I wonder. And then I end up just like picking the wrong answer, even though I'm like, yeah, I straight up knew that it was D and I was just trying to like test myself. I don't know. Whereas exam mode really puts me in like a focused position. And I'm like, okay, this is a real exam. For some reason, I just do way better on exam mode. Like I get less stressed. I get less like overwhelmed. Exam mode's better for me. So like that's a little thing that I know now that I will be doing exclusively from now on. But
so then so study mode is you review the question right after you answer it?
Yes.
And then exam mode is at the end of it?
Yeah. So for me, I started doing everything on study mode because I was studying. So I was like, duh, I'm going to do it on study mode. And I, like I said, would just like second guess myself so much on study mode because it's not timed. So you just could sit there forever and not have that like external pressure of a timer counting down. So I would sit there forever and just like guess between 2 answer choices, even though I knew that one was better. Like, I don't know. I can't explain it still. But once I switched over to exam mode, like having to go through all 40 questions with a finite amount of time with kind of the external pressure of like being on a clock was so much better for me. And also you don't have the stress of like, oh, I just got that question wrong. Like moving on to the next question, it kind of screws up your mindset. So in exam mode, you don't have that issue. You're just like, well, we'll see how it goes. And usually it went way better than on study mode.
Kind of switching gears, and I guess this is not probably a nice topic to go into, but what happens if you don't pass step 1 or COMLEX 1?
What happens is you take it again, which doesn't look great, but I also kind of think that there's a lot of like fear mongering that happens around that topic. And I think that's screwed up. That's like not helpful for anyone. So what happens for us anyway, at TCOM is they don't delay your rotations as far as I'm aware. I think you get like 1 free block to study. Like you take an elective at the earliest.
So they like swap you up. So if you had been already scheduled for something, they move it around.
They'll
your
switch it
elective
up
is
and they'll
dedicated.
Yep, they'll give you an elective and give you that time to prepare to take it again. Yeah, and that's what you do. But for STEP, it's a little bit more complicated because, of course, the school, at least our school, doesn't give you extra time to prepare for STEP. So you kind of have to do both. And, they always tell you that it doesn't look good to fail STEP. Like it looks worse to fail STEP than to not take it at all. But the reality is that there's a small percentage of people who don't pass STEP. Like the national average is like 92% pass rate, I think. Or at least it was at one point when I checked. And so that's a small percentage of people who aren't passing. And I think only you can know if you're at risk. Like no one can tell you that, I don't think. Like my biggest pet peeve with how people portray like the pressures of passing STEP is like, well, if you take 2 tests, like there's a higher chance you're going to fail. And it's like, well, we have the tools to prepare ourselves to not fail, but not taking it is like you're not giving yourself that chance at all to do well. So, yeah, you have to retake it. It might not look the best, but that's again, like a personal thing that.
Yeah. I think at that point, it's hopefully you're utilizing the resources that you know are good for you. You're putting in the hours. I guess the other thing is just because it's gone past fail doesn't mean you don't need to study as hard.
Yes. Yeah.
I think, I remember statistically your class on average had a lower pass rate.
Yeah.
Because potentially, again, this is one of those things, it's just pass fail. So I don't need to work as hard.
Yeah.
And then may have underestimated. I'm not saying like everybody did, but it's just one of those things like it's pass fail. I'll be okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those mental things that you may, again, not you specifically, but in general, people that had switched to the pass fail just thought that, okay, well, I don't need to work as hard because it's pass fail, so it'd be okay. And I think it's unfortunate that you don't really know, because a pass is just a pass. Like, you don't know your number. Like, how close was I to passing?
Yeah.
Or how far away was I from that number?
Yeah.
And it is very much so one where if you're doing your due diligence and you hitting certain percentages on U-World questions, and okay, you should be more or less okay. Or you're doing well on your practice exams.
I think our school does a good job of giving us lots of tools to see where we're at prior to dedicated starting. Like, we had the FBS, which is a pretty high predictive value. We had the CBSE, which is also a really high predictive value. You have COMSE, which I don't know about, but if you're doing very poorly on those tests, like, those tests tell you what your chances of passing within a week are. And if you're doing poorly, like, that's an indicator that you've got to put in the work to like get there. I say that generally if you've been doing well in your classes, you're probably not super at risk, but that doesn't mean that you can just like la-di-da, like skate through the semester and skate through dedicated and then just show up to the exam and take it, because that's a fantasy.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Jessie, for coming through.
Thanks for having me.
Dogs for being menaces and hanging out the entire time as well. You're great cheerleaders. If you haven't done so already, go ahead, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.
Thanks.
A bientôt.